the classic mainstream nutrition advice for hypoglycemia is to eat lean protein and complex carbs every 2 hours. And if you know even a little bit about physiology, you know that that is just going to make the root cause of this worse.
Makes sense.
When I was doing paleo, that's when I actually developed hypoglycemia, PCOS. I was having half a banana blended in my iced coffee. I was doing coconut sugar and honey and maple syrup in all my recipes. So it was no wonder I was struggling with these issues. I got this analogy from one of my past blood sugar mastery clients, and she says that if you fall off the rails, don't just go around and be like, oh, it's all over for me. Like, I might as well just eat everything else. Like, and she compares it to like, if you got a flat tire, you wouldn't just walk around and slash the other 3 tires.
I think you're spot on. I agree.
Anyone who's trying to get healthy and honestly improve any symptom in their health, this is the number one tip that I have for people. And it is,
hey everyone, welcome back to What the Fat. My name is Dr. Ryan Lowry, and today I have an incredible guest, someone who I've been wanting to connect with for a very long time, Danielle Hamilton. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ryan. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's jump into it because I see you posting all the time, and you talk all about glucose and insulin and how these things have a really big impact on our overall health. First and foremost, maybe let's just talk a little bit about why do insulin and glucose affect our health? And maybe I like to look at this term like health span or aging. Like, why does having a high amount of blood glucose or a high amount of insulin like age us faster?
Yeah, so our blood sugar is something that impacts how we feel at every second of every day. And it also has huge impacts on our long-term health. So it affects us in the short term because it's how our body gets energy. And so our body likes to have about like a teaspoon of sugar in our blood at all times. And if it sort of deviates from that too much, it's very stressful for the body. So high blood sugar drives high inflammation, reactive oxidative species. We get AGES, so it ages us faster, those advanced glycation end products. So it's driving a whole series of unwanted negative effects every time we have those blood sugar spikes or we have this chronic high blood sugar. And that will drive or promote poor long-term effects. And this can also happen with people with low blood sugar. I feel like people like me who had hypoglycemia are really left out of the conversation when it comes to blood sugar. And it's a huge population of people who are struggling with this. And most often they don't know it, I find. And maybe we can touch on that later. But the low blood sugar is often, I see this happen when there is some sort of adrenal component going on where there's sort of maybe we were in a high state of stress, lots of cortisol, and then we've sort of hit the wall and we run out and we are depleted. Our adrenals are depleted. Often I see minerals very depleted. And what happens is if the blood sugar is dipping too low, whether right after a meal because we got too big of a spike of insulin, or if it's just sort of dropping as we're fasting, both of these things will cause our stress system to just pump us with stress hormones to get that blood sugar back up in an emergency type situation. Our body does have other checks for this. So typically the liver should be able to give us just a little bit of sugar if the blood sugar is dropping. And that's not stressful for the body at all. That's just a normal regulation. But with insulin resistance, which so many people have, new studies are showing about upwards of 93% of our population is already struggling with this. That insulin, the high levels of insulin, block the liver from being able to put more sugar into the system because it thinks, oh, we need to get sugar out of the blood right now. We need to be in a fat storage mode. So it also blocks fat burning. So it blocks us from using fat or body fat to fuel us. It blocks us from getting the sugar that's stored in our liver. So then that blood sugar is going down and we have nothing left but the adrenals to come in and sort of they act as this like backup generator to pump us with stress hormones in order to create new glucose. And if you think about the words like stress hormones are glucocorticoids, gluco being that, they're creating new sugar, telling the liver to create new sugar. And so That process is also very expensive for the adrenals, drains us of minerals. And over time, if we're just constantly on this up and down sort of roller coaster, it is, again, very stressful for the body. It's driving either high cortisol levels, which is dysregulating things, putting us in this chronically stressed state. We know that stress and overabundance of cortisol have just so many negative impacts on our body. So it's just it sort of snowballs from there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's crazy how much it affects. Let's talk a little bit and back up a little bit about like hypoglycemia versus hyperglycemia. Can you explain those two for people who are like, oh, those sound like big words. What does that mean?
Yeah, don't be nervous. I struggled with issues for years with my health, and I really purposefully avoided learning about blood sugar and insulin because I'm like, that's boring. That's pretty complicated. I don't have diabetes, so why do I need to care? But it was really impacting my health. So I try to make this real easy to understand because I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist. I'm just kind of a lay person, and I make it easy enough to understand so that I can do what I need to do to stay healthy. So hyperglycemia is a state of high blood sugar. And this is what we see oftentimes when there's insulin resistance, and that insulin, its job is to take the sugar out of the blood and put it into the cells of the body to use for making energy or storing for later as stored energy, body fat. And that insulin, when we're spiking it over time, or there's lots of toxins in our body and we're consuming vegetable oils, which inflame the cell membranes, or we're just over consuming carbohydrates, even the healthy ones, that was my issue, even all those, healthy whole food carbohydrates, we can still find ourselves where our insulin levels are rising over time. Poor sleep. I mean, our modern lifestyles really just are contributing to this in a big way. So our insulin levels in our blood are ticking up, and the receptors start to become sort of desensitized to the message of insulin. So now the insulin's knocking on the door of the cell saying, hey, I have some glucose for you. And the cells are like, la, 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 I don't care. Like, you were just here, kind of like, I'm done with you. So now we need 2, 3, 4 times the amount of insulin to do the job of lowering the blood sugar. But what happens is the amount of sugar starts to build up in the blood because it can't get into the cells. And so this leads to this chronically high blood sugar, and it's often driven by insulin resistance. So it's very rare that you'd have someone who has chronically high blood sugar without insulin resistance. I don't know even if that really happens, right? So the problem with this is it's not really a sugar problem. It's sort of the impact of the insulin issues are creating an issue with blood sugar, which is much easier for us to test and measure and what our doctor's looking at. But the problem with this hyperglycemia is often that doctors in the mainstream are very focused on the blood sugar number and trying to bring the blood sugar down by any means possible. But they're ignoring what's at the root of it, what's causing the blood sugar to be high in the first place. So even if we're taking, there's certain supplements like bitter melon and all these things to help lower gymnema, to help lower blood sugar. It's like, why would we artificially want to lower blood sugar instead of getting at the root, which is why our insulin is high? So that's a little bit of hyperglycemia. And this is what is happening when someone has prediabetes and diabetes. And it's just really the insulin resistance has gotten that bad that the sugar is just creeping up and up and up. And finally, once it hits a certain number, then the doctors can give you that label. With hypoglycemia, there's 2 different types. There is fasting hypoglycemia, where if you haven't eaten in a while or maybe overnight, this used to be me, I'd wake up shaking. And I thought, I'm just a breakfast person. No, your blood sugar's 60, and you're not metabolically flexible. So that's not a good thing for you. So, if you're hypoglycemic, if you struggle to go long periods of time without eating. I used to hear people say, I think I forgot to eat lunch. Oh my gosh. And I'm like, okay, you're either lying or just showing off or something. I mean, I was a person, I could never think about skipping a meal. I mean, it would be a couple minutes into my lunchtime if a meeting was going long. I'd start to get angry at whoever was having the meeting. I'd be irritable. I'd be hangry. I'd have cravings. I couldn't pay attention. I would get dizzy and shaky and lightheaded, sometimes heart palpitations. So these are just some of the early signs that you may be having these dips in blood sugar. And then the other type of hypoglycemia is reactive hypoglycemia, and that's where we find that blood sugar goes low after a meal. And oftentimes it's because we get too big of a spike, the body overshoots insulin, and then we end up with the blood sugar going too low because the insulin put away too much blood sugar. Some people are just naturally like insulin hypersecretors by nature, and I think that sometimes our past habitual dietary tendencies can sort of predict this as well, or sort of lead to this as well. And what I mean by that is that if I have a history of, all my life, I grew up in the 80s and 90s eating, cereal, Eggo waffles and oatmeal and toaster strudels and granola bars. Like every time I ate, my pancreas was like, oh, she's eating. Like, let's strap in, boys. Like, we're going to have to give a bunch of insulin now. So if I'm like going to eat something, my pancreas is like, okay, we know that we usually have to give so much insulin. I mean, over years and years and years and years, every time I ate, this would be the case. So that could also set someone up for having like a huge amount of insulin at a meal because habitually they're eating types of foods that would drive them to have a high insulin response. So if you get too high of an insulin response, then your blood sugar will end up lower and you may have this crash after you eat. And so I think a lot of people are maybe familiar with some of those feelings of after I eat, just feeling really tired, feeling like I need another coffee, shaky, anxious, really big one. And for me, actually, if my blood sugar is spiking right at the peak of that spike, I will start to notice that I have really bad cravings. That's when my sugar dragon, I call him, wakes up and it's like, hey, you should go get more sugar. You should get chocolate. Do we have ice cream in the house? It's just like, whose voice is this? Because it's certainly not mine. And yeah, that sugar dragon, when you have that blood sugar that's on a roller coaster, he's really in there, calling the shots. So either of these issues with hypoglycemia are really significant because the classic mainstream nutrition advice for hypoglycemia is to eat lean protein and complex carbs every 2 hours. This is especially for the hypoglycemia. And if you know even a little bit about physiology, you know that is just going to make the root cause of this worse, because a lean protein, which will have some insulinogenic effect, and a complex carb, I don't care if it has a little rice bran on the outside, like it's still going to spike your blood sugar. It's still, if we're saying a complex carb, that may mean a starch, which is actually one of the foods that raises insulin the most. And it's just starches are long chains of glucose molecules. So when they digest in the body, we're getting a boatload of sugar. And so this, unfortunately, will be causing us to spike our blood sugar and insulin and put us right back on that blood sugar roller coaster, needing us to eat again every couple of hours. So a lot of clients that I see, oftentimes some people have some sort of combo of both of the hypoglycemias. So there are a couple of cases where there are people where they say, I feel so much better if I don't eat. And then as soon as I eat, then I start to be on that roller coaster. And there's many different causes for reactive hypoglycemia. But in general, like I was saying, that we see this mineral depletion. People can't keep their blood sugar up, a lot of stress, a lot of cortisol issues. There could be issues with GLP-1 and interleukin-6, and which can drive hypersensitivity to insulin. So sometimes I do see people where they're eating the meal, and as they're eating, their blood sugar is crashing. So it's like they're super, super sensitive to any insulin. Those are tricky cases. But hypoglycemia is one of the things, I guess, if we're going to that mainstream advice, what we do instead of that is we really need to center what that meal is missing, that lean protein and the complex carb, is that we're missing fat. And fat is the only macronutrient that has no impact on insulin, and it actually can help us to go longer between meals. So I think about fat as like a log on the fire. It burns low and slow, whereas the carbs are more like the kindling. They burn hot and fast. And so if we build a plate centered around fatty proteins, and having the fat in the protein for some reason has been really extra helpful for my clients. Even if they were to have like a lean protein and then have just as many grams of fat, I find that it's not as helpful for stabilizing their blood sugar. And I don't know the mechanism behind this. I've just seen it so many times that I can't ignore it. So this fattier protein, really, really helpful. Having extra fats on the plate, lots of fiber from green veggies to slow the absorption. And then at the beginning, these people will need some sort of carbohydrate. We can't just take that from them. And so what I do with my clients is have a decreasing amount of carbohydrates over time. So we want to find that sort of balance where we do get a little bit of a curve, meaning a glucose curve. And sometimes we get a bigger area under the curve because the digestion is slower because we have all that fat. And that's really what helps take them to the next meal. And then we're able to sort of lower those carbs. And then oftentimes getting into a state of nutritional ketosis, which will allow them to develop that metabolic flexibility that they were lacking. That's why their body couldn't regulate their blood sugar in the first place. So that's sort of the how I work with that. Yeah.
No, it's brilliant. And I think it's funny because I remember back to when I used to be a chronic snacker. And it was like I was on that roller coaster that you talked about. It's like I'd eat a meal in the morning. I was one of those kids back in the 90s that had like 4 bowls of cereal in the morning. And then I'd be like, I need a snack before lunch. And it's just, what are the snacks? Oh, it's a granola bar. That's healthy. Granola is healthy. It's like, well, it actually was just like painted and covered in sugar. It had chocolate chips in it. It was more of a candy bar than anything.
Absolutely. There were Kudos bars. Did you have Kudos bars?
Oh, yes.
They were so good. It was like a candy bar with a granola bar inside. Yeah.
It was great. And then some of the school lunches were just horrible. But I think it's a combination for a lot of people of like, they go through periods where they think they're eating healthy, or they might be having like, oh, I had an acai bowl or something. Oh, I had avocado toast. That's healthy, right? Like, so people do that. And then they're also in this habit. So it's like a lot of it's habitual of like, I know when I'm at my desk at 10:30, I'm having a snack, and like the part of it's because their glucose is they're going hypoglycemic, but also it's just like this habit. So one of my questions for you is, with your clients, how do you fix that like hangry, that snacking that they get typically in between meals? Do you go and say, hey, well, let's address the meals before and after at first, and then let's talk about the type of snack? How do you approach that?
Yeah, so great question. And I definitely want to come back to what you mentioned about like the acai bowls and the avocado toast, because I call that like a conscious standard American diet, where people are thinking they're trying to be healthy. And so they'll get the whole wheat bread or Ezekiel bread, and they'll do the brown rice and the acai bowls and the green juices and the smoothies. And meanwhile, all of these foods, that was me when I was doing paleo. That's when I actually developed hypoglycemia, PCOS. I was eating a healthy whole foods paleo diet, but I was having half a banana blended in my iced coffee. I was doing coconut sugar and honey and maple syrup in all my recipes. And I was doing a whole sweet potato with my steak and acai bowls and smoothies and all the things. So it was no wonder I was struggling with these issues. But so your question about how do we get rid of the hangry feelings, the snackish feelings, the first tip that I give, and if you take away anything from this podcast, and, for anyone who's trying to get healthy and honestly improve any symptom in their health, this is the number one tip that I have for people. And it is, eat a lot of animal protein and eat all of it on your plate first until you literally cannot take another bite of protein. And this is my favorite tip because we have this protein threshold in our body where we're going to keep eating until we get the amount of protein that our body needs. And then we have that strong sort of cutoff where we're like, we can't take another bite of it unless we're Joey from Friends getting the meat sweats. I don't know if you watch that show, but like you really can't overeat protein very much. So I know personally, I've been in a situation where I've been eating a steak and I'm like, God, I cannot take one more bite of this steak. And it's like, oh, but I could finish some of this broccoli. Oh, I can have some of the sweet potato. There's room for dessert. There's always room for the extra, but it's once you hit that protein threshold, your body will have all the essential amino acids that it needs, and then there will still be room for other things, but the protein is also the most satiating macronutrient, so it is naturally going to satiate you and help moderate your appetite, so that I have so many people saying, I'm just eating my protein first, and I don't even need the sweet potato. Like, I don't even feel hungry for it. And if you are eating enough protein, enough fat and fiber at your meals, you will absolutely, unless you're struggling with all this hypoglycemia stuff, be able to go long periods and really make it to your next meal without feeling hungry. And I think that especially women, and being raised in the 90s, like we're taught, oh, eat like birds, eat 6 small meals and watch your calories. Like people have a plate like this. It's like, no, ladies, fill up your plate too, So a general rule of thumb would be about 30 grams of protein for females, about 50 for males. And of course we need to personalize, but that would be a really good rule of thumb. And again, your body will kind of be the one to tell you like, okay, I just can't have any more of this. And so like, people are like, oh, I'm having eggs for breakfast. I'm like, I'm so proud of you. You're doing proteins and fats. That's great. How many eggs are you having? And they're like 2. I'm like, well, that's only 12 grams of protein, so we need to have more. So just keep in mind that eggs are only 6 grams of protein. So this is something that just a quick Google search, ask Alexa, she might start talking. But just ask the robots, how much protein is in this amount, and start to really prioritize protein. I like animal protein. I know you do too. It is the most bioavailable, and it doesn't come packed with a bunch of starch that's going to raise your insulin and block some of the nutrients because of those anti-nutrients in there. So yeah, so eat the protein, add those healthy fats. A lot of people question, what are healthy fats? So maybe I'll go into that. So first off, I like to get the fats from the meat I'm eating. So choose fattier cuts like a ribeye or, fatty pork or lamb or some of these like heavier fat cuts. And then there's also egg yolks, fatty fish, and then there's the fruit fats. So avocados, olives, and coconuts, and all their oils and their products are good to go. And then nuts and seeds are other sources, but this can be sort of a gray area. And depending on who you talk to, they do have some anti-nutrients and high levels of linoleic acid. So maybe not the best for some people, but if we're looking on a spectrum of like someone coming from a standard American diet and they're choosing nuts, I'm like, great, fantastic. But as someone who is also trying to just be mindful of what they're eating and maybe is in a, snacking habit, nuts can be this like avalanche food. So taking your portions, ahead of time and not just like sitting with a giant bag of nuts because all of a sudden you're just eating them. And I truly feel that it's because nuts are pretty low in protein. They're more of like a fat and a carb source. And so it's just energy. And so if you think about snack foods in general, most snack foods are very low in protein and high in both carbs and fats, which are the energy sources. So we keep eating them because our body's like energy, 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 but we don't get the protein satiation cutoff, so we can just keep going and going. This could be something like a candy bar, ice cream, popcorn, so sweet snacks, savory snacks, crackers, like all sorts of things are like high in carbs and fats, and then they're low in protein, these snack foods. So avoiding things like that, prioritizing the protein, super, super important. And then the other fat would be dairy. And so this is obviously another area, very, very bio-individual. Most people can tolerate ghee and butter. I would just really warn against, especially if you feel like you have insulin resistance, if you know you have it, whey protein raises insulin a ton, and milk also raises insulin a ton. So I would eliminate or avoid or minimize those if you're struggling. But otherwise, some dairy, best quality possible, raw if possible, could be another source of healthy fats.
That's fantastic. It's great advice. And I'm hearing it more and more. I think people like you, my friend Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, like, especially for women, like, I think a lot of times I see it all the time. My mom, like, I'm like, Mom, like, she's like, oh, she's that type of person. I ate 2 eggs today. You'd be so proud of me. I'm like, I am proud of you, but that is 12 grams of protein. We need to like get a little bit more. We need about like 15, 20 more grams on there. How are we going to get that?
Yes.
And so I think that's going to be a real mind shift for a lot of people, is understanding like how much actually for females is 30 grams, for males 50 grams. I think that's great advice. And I think for a lot of people, it's trying to figure out how to hit that. Now, with the snacks, what are some, maybe your top 3, 4 snacks that you recommend? Would it be like beef jerky? What are some of our higher protein snacks that you recommend if someone's like, I just really need to have a snack in between my meals?
Okay, so first off, I think that for the average person, I do not recommend snacking at all. And I always say I don't believe in a healthy snack because I don't think snacking is healthy in and of itself. I use the term instead mini meal, because if I think about snack foods and I think about a mini meal, they conjure up really different thoughts in my mind. If I think about snack food, it's something that's packaged. But if I think about a mini meal, it's already going to be more balanced. And I personally am just going to pull some leftovers from my fridge. So I could pull a hard-boiled egg, a little bit of like a piece of an avocado, some veggies or whatever, and then you get this mini meal. So I like to encourage people to do mini meals instead, if they need to, if they're struggling with hypoglycemia, as these like training wheels. In terms of things that are portable, higher protein things, I would, hard-boiled eggs, Paleo Valley beef sticks, or a clean jerky would be a good choice. If you do, you can get guac and some pork rinds or something like that, which aren't the highest in protein. But yeah, things along those lines. If you tolerate cheese, that would be something. A Greek yogurt could be another idea as well. So thinking about things that are a little more portable, and then even like some sort of as good of quality as you can find, like lunch meat, cold cut type things. Just sort of, I would maybe take that traveling if I'm, going for a road trip, something easy and easy protein. So yeah, so some of those things would be, I just really look to get my protein. And then I would also maybe do some sort of like a grass-fed beef protein isolate protein shake as something as well. My people with reactive hypoglycemia most often they can't really do too many protein shakes because it's too lean and they will just immediately crash. So yeah.
Right. Makes sense. Now let's talk briefly about some, like, are there any carb sources? I know you talked about like high fibers vegetables. What are some other carb sources? Like, maybe give some examples for people to be like, okay, cool. I know I need to dial in my animal proteins. I need to make sure that ideally those proteins have a little bit of fat with them, like a ribeye, so to speak. Let's talk a little bit about what carb sources, if someone's like, well, what's left on my plate, so to speak?
Yeah. So in terms of, I like to think about that fat, protein, fiber formula for building a plate. And then depending on your level
Cool.
of metabolic health, we can also add some healthy carbs. So the fiber and the carbs are actually, they're both carbohydrates because fiber is a carbohydrate, but it doesn't really impact our blood sugar. It actually slows the absorption of sugar into our system, which helps our insulin work on it a little bit faster so it doesn't spike our blood sugar as much. So fiber and carbs, fiber would look like above ground vegetables. So like think about like green vegetables, leafy vegetables, things that are not sweet tasting. So peppers, cucumbers, summer squashes, lettuces, greens, even tomatoes. They're not very high carb. I think when you cook them, for some people, it impacts blood sugar more. And yeah, so thinking about those things as a good source of fiber on our plate. And then when it comes to carbohydrates, There's a couple of categories left because I always recommend when it comes to blood sugar, we want these carbohydrates to be as whole as possible. So basically as they grew from the ground. Seasonal is also really important. And this is a much harder thing to achieve because in our grocery stores now, there's just stuff from everywhere, all over the world, and we have no idea what's in season near us. So I like to walk through the store with like, what's in season in Texas in January? And I'm just, walking around with my list and at least something that has the potential to be grown in season, even if it's not grown from my area. At least I know that the light was kind of similar, and which is a whole other topic we could get into, but it's really important to eat as seasonally as possible. And one of the reasons for that is just because when UV light hits our skin, it changes our gut bacteria to be better able to digest like simple carbohydrates like sugars. And so if you are in Canada and it's the winter and you're eating bananas and mangoes, your body is getting a really confusing message because that food was grown with so much light. It's grown in the tropics, and here you're outside and it's getting dark at like 4 p.m. and your body, it's a confusing message, and it will raise your blood sugar more and drive inflammation. So our light environment is really, really important. But back to carbs, we want carbs as they grew from the ground. So that would be fruits. It would be starchy vegetables. So things like butternut squash, winter squashes, potatoes, sweet potatoes, things like that. And then there's also some veggies like beets and carrots, which are not as high in starch, but they are root vegetables. So they contain some more carbs. And then there are legumes, which do have some starch in them. And I look at those, like some people look at those as a protein source. I look at them as a carb source. And then there are grains, and grains have the most carbs and also the least amount of nutrition per calorie. So I like to kind of go with more of like the fruits, maybe some starchy vegetables, because I find that those are the most nutrient dense. And I also kind of come from that paleo camp as well.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about the value of testing. So like testing and understanding your numbers, whether that's through finger pricks, CGM. I know you have a lot of experience with that as well. And then we can dive into like, all right, based on what you've seen, like how do certain things affect your blood glucose and what have you seen with maybe some of your clients? So first, maybe let's just talk about like, there's different ways to test blood glucose, right? You got a finger prick, you have what's called a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor. Then there's ways that you can measure a hemoglobin A1C, which is a marker of like your glucose over an extended period of time. Maybe talk about what you recommend.
Yeah, so your doctor will typically test your fasting glucose and your A1C. So take advantage of these because they're good numbers to get, but don't rely on your doctor to interpret them for you because I don't use the doctor's traditional ranges. So with fasting glucose, and I'm going to talk about milligrams per deciliter. So if you're outside of the US, just divide all these numbers by 18 to get the millimoles. So typically, your doctor will say under 100 is fine for fasting glucose, and that's not fine. I like to use about 72 to 85 as optimal. And so if you're 86 to 99, I say that there's probably insulin resistance starting to brew and that you would very likely benefit from starting to think about some of these, optimization strategies because we're already seeing this rise in the glucose. Then the doctor's ranges would be 100 to 125 is prediabetes, and I'm not diagnosing anybody. And then 126 and above would be type 2 diabetic range. What's often missed, again, in this conversation is where does hypoglycemia come in? So my blood sugar, as I said at the beginning, was 60, and I almost passed out after I left my appointment in 2012. I felt backwards like that. And I was like, oh my goodness, why is this happening? Like, I'm such a breakfast person. I had no idea. And so hypoglycemia, doctors might say like, oh, true hypoglycemia is at like 50, but we forget about the true. Think about how you feel. So if your blood sugar is 80, which I would say is perfection, but you feel like you're dizzy, you're shaking, you're anxious, your heart's pounding, It's not good. So you have to feel good at the number that you're at. And people can experience symptoms of hypoglycemia at any blood sugar number. And so this is something that I really want to get out there, because doctors will say, people will go to their doctor and say, oh my gosh, like I feel so terrible. I'm having all these symptoms, list all these symptoms of hypoglycemia. And their doctor takes their blood sugar and they're like, well, it's 100. So it can't be your blood sugar. You're fine. But what I've seen happen is that this terrible advice about eating the protein and carbs, or like people self-medicating with sugar every time their blood sugar crashes, it drives insulin resistance, which drives up the blood sugar, but they're still getting the crashes. Now the line of the blood sugar has just moved up. So I had someone come to me and she said, Dani, I've had hypoglycemia since high school and now I'm retired. So I looked at her CGM, we put a CGM on her, and her blood sugar was spiking up to 300 and her crashes were at 160. So she was having hypoglycemia feelings at 160. And so the doctor might call this postprandial syndrome, where you're feeling like, after your meal, it's crashing, but it's not truly going low. But this is what I see when you are feeling the low and your blood sugar is not truly low. This is usually due to insulin resistance. It's kind of like your body's thermostat has been raised. So it's like if I'm in this room and I feel fine, and then I go take a really hot shower for 20 minutes, I come back in this room, I'm going to feel freezing. I'm going to say, oh, turn the heat up. I need a sweater, because my body's thermostat was raised. So it's the same kind of concept with the hypoglycemia. The body's like, oh, we're running low on energy. There's lack of metabolic flexibility. And so it's like the gas light will come on in the car, and it just starts doing that at higher and higher numbers. So that's one of the most important things to know about these glucose numbers, is that we have to take into consideration how we feel. So if your blood sugar is below 70, if you're on a ketogenic diet, you can have lower blood sugar oftentimes than we talked about, but you'd have to be feeling good. If you're feeling good, pretty much that should be okay. But again, any hypoglycemia issues will really you'll be symptomatic at these numbers. Okay, that's my long-winded explanation of fasting glucose. So then we have A1C, which is a measure of our average glucose over the last 3 months. And your doctor will say, 5.7 is where prediabetes starts. And so we want to be 5.6 and under. I really like to use a tighter range. And so I would say maybe around, 5.2 might be the highest I really want to see it. What do you say, Ryan?
No, I think you're spot on. I agree.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And then one of the other things you can get from your doctor, which they don't test for, and you have to ask, and even if you ask, they still may not give you the test. You can order your own online labs, is a fasting insulin. So remember, glucose, sugar, blood sugar is glucose. That's the sugar. But insulin is a hormone, the hormone that puts the sugar away. So we want to look at both of these things. We don't have continuous insulin monitors yet. Really hope in my lifetime those show up. But the insulin is a really good number to test, and there's no standardized ranges on here. So depending on which expert you ask, they're going to give you a different number. But I think that symptoms really come into play here. So if you're already starting to be symptomatic and your number is above 5, I would say that, yeah, we're already starting to see an issue. You can also get an oral glucose tolerance test and look at this and get it with insulin to kind of see what your insulin is doing. We don't want to see it spiking to like 3,000, 200 or whatever after a meal. So that's something else I would get from your doctor. And we want to see it generally, the ranges that I use, I default to like Ben Bickman's ranges is about 2 to 5. So then it comes to testing our own blood sugar. And this is what we can do at home. So we can do the finger prick monitor, and, you tend to feel like a human pincushion, but it is helpful. And so we would test our blood sugar. When do you want to test? You can do the fasting. you could do right before a meal, and then like every 20 to 30 minutes after that meal to kind of see the pattern of what your blood sugar is doing, sort of capturing the curve that happens afterwards. Because if I just test my blood sugar before the meal and then test it 2 hours later, yes, we want to see it come back to baseline within 2 hours, but it could have risen by 1 point or it could have risen by 300 points and come crashing down. So we have to get really granular here and look at all those different points, and then we can plot the points on a graph, sort of making our own CGM. So I really like this to verify. Sometimes the CGMs are a little bit off. You know, we could send a man to the moon, but we can't accurately measure our blood sugar. It's a little frustrating, but I like to use the finger prick devices. I think they're a little bit more accurate. So sometimes if your CGM's acting up, you can use that. You can use it between meters. So I do, honestly, if you have the means to get both. And then the CGMs, there's a bunch of companies now that will help you get the devices, get a prescription. Because once again, you can ask your doctor for this, but most doctors will be like, no, your insurance won't cover it, or no, because I don't have a code to bill it under, or no, why on earth would you need that when it's only for people with uncontrolled type 2 diabetes and type 1 diabetes? We're using this as a prevention tool and a learning tool, because blood sugar is so personal. What my blood sugar looks like, what spikes my blood sugar, which we'll talk about in a second, it's going to be totally different from yours and from the next person's. We all have really individual blood sugar. So this is my favorite tool, the continuous glucose monitor, for learning about what affects you. And so we can start to see, like, how much did my blood sugar rise after a meal? We really want to keep it under about a 30 milligrams per deciliter spike. We don't want it to rise up that much. We don't really want it to dip below baseline. And we also don't want to see really sharp changes. So if it's going straight up, or if it's going straight down, that change feels terrible in the body. Remembering back to our, 8th grade biology days, the body is just fighting for homeostasis, and a sharp rise or change in our blood sugar is throwing that off. So the body is going to react, but it kind of overreacts because it's in that like, oh crap mode. And so it'll shoot you with insulin, or it's like got too much insulin, so it's going to shoot you with stress hormones. So if we want these gradual rolling hills as opposed to like mountain peaks and cliffs, because that's what feels better in our body. That's where we don't have symptoms. We feel energized. Our brain is working. We have clarity of thought. We have good moods. We aren't thinking about food. But once you start getting those big peaks and valleys, that's when all those symptoms start showing up. And that's when it can progress into so many other things. Like I had PCOS. I had polycystic ovarian syndrome. I couldn't get to the root of it, and I didn't realize it was because of my blood sugar. So that was a symptom of blood sugar issues for me, like and insulin issues, and I had no idea. So it can show up in all these weird ways. So yeah, I'll let you jump in.
Is there a specific brand that you prefer for both finger blood glucose and CGM?
So for the finger prick, there's 2 companies I like. I like Fora, Fora, and I also like the Keto Mojo. And for the CGMs, any of the companies that are here in the US are really fantastic, because they come with really good apps that help you look at the data in a better way than just the, Freestyle Libre or Dexcom app. Those are the 2 typical brands of the devices. And so, if you have like the Levels app, the NutriSense app, Signos, Veri, those are kind of the, main 4 that I might recommend. You can log a meal. It can show you like, it gives you a meal score. You can see granular, like how much did my blood sugar actually rise? What was the area under the curve? And then a lot of these companies will send you an email with like a daily score and how many spikes did you have? And, what's your variability? That's one of the things that we really want to get down, is that glucose variability, which are those excursions, right? The changes in the blood sugar. So that's why I really like these apps. I'm not necessarily like married to one or another. I'm a little bit Switzerland in this area. And I just think that if you have the means, that it is really probably, I find the probably best investment you can make in your health, because Then the second part of your question was, what are the kinds of things we can learn from these CGMs and what impacts our blood sugar? So of course, food, that's going to be the first thing. It's going to be like, how is this food impacting my blood sugar? How does it impact my blood sugar if I have it by itself versus with a meal? What about if I have half the amount I normally have versus the whole amount? So we can play with quantities. Quantity is huge when it comes to our blood sugar. So it may not be like, oh, I can't ever have a sweet potato again. It's just like, oh, maybe I just need 3 or 4 bites, and that's the perfect amount for me. It gives me enough carbs, but isn't too much that it's making me crash, right? Then we get to see the effect of timing, which is one of my favorite things to look at. So for me and for many people, we have way better insulin sensitivity, which means our blood sugar will be better in the daytime hours, especially for me in the morning. So if I eat carbs in the morning, my blood sugar is a nice flat line. If I eat that exact same meal at dinner, especially if the sun has gone down, I do not recommend eating when the sun has gone down. When the sun goes down, insulin clocks out, So in the evening time, if I eat that same meal, my blood sugar will go higher and stay higher longer because the insulin is struggling to get it where it needs to go. So that's what I find with the meal timing. You can figure out what works best for you. And so again, maybe we're looking at quantity, timing, and then we can look at movement. So we can look at what effect does exercise have on my blood sugar if I exercise after a meal. So one of the best strategies for stabilizing your blood sugar is moving after your meals, because you just consumed energy and the glucose. And so you can utilize that energy if you walk after the meal, and you can do a workout, you can do squats in the bathroom at work or whatever it is, like get that movement in. And the amount of movement will depend on how many carbs you had, and then the other factors of how insulin sensitive you are. So I don't want to say, oh, all you need to do is just go for a 10-minute walk after meals. It's a great start, and it's going to be better than not doing it, but it's not guaranteeing that, oh, if I just walk for 10 minutes, then I can eat a candy bar. Like, that's not what I'm saying. So we want the output to match what's going in. And then the other thing is we can see, what happens if I have a really hard workout and deplete all the glycogen, which is the stored sugar in my muscles, before I eat, and then you eat, and oftentimes you can eat a carb-rich meal and you get no spike because the sugar just goes straight into the muscles without needing insulin. And so that's one of the best ways, a great hack to stabilize your blood sugar. And then we can also see, what effect do different stressors have on my blood sugar? Because oftentimes stress, remember we talked about those glucocorticoid hormones, that stress often drives a blood sugar spike. So a lot of our strategies to stay healthy and biohacks, people freak out because they're like, my blood sugar spiked when I was at the gym doing a HIIT workout, or my blood sugar spiked when I was in the sauna, or my blood sugar spiked when I did a cold plunge. And this is because it is increasing your stress. So we just want to make sure that this becomes a hormetic stressor for you, and not going into the eustress or distress region where it's like, oh, I can't recover from that spike. So did you spike and then you crashed so hard that you needed a nap and you felt tired the next day? That would be, oh, that spike was not good for me. It was too much for me. But in general, for the average person, healthy person looking to optimize, you may be okay if you have those spikes. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I spike if I take a hot bath because of the heat. So just keep in mind those things can definitely raise your blood sugar. But then we can also see, having an argument, we may get a spike. Or if if there's a chronic stressor like a death of a loved one or something happening, we may just see that line of blood sugar shifting higher, because now we're having just in general more cortisol and more stress hormones in the system, which is raising our blood sugar. And then for my hypoglycemia people, we may be crashing more. That tends to be what I see. And then finally, we can look at menstrual cycles and hormones and the impact of that on blood sugar. So a lot of women say that the week before their cycle, some say the week of their cycle, their blood sugar is worse than normal. So for many that means higher, but for some it means crashing more. And then as women go through menopause and they lose their estrogen and progesterone, we become less insulin sensitive. And so we may start to see the effects of that on our CGMs.
I could sit here all day and ask you a million things about how does this affect your glucose? I think we'll definitely have to do our round 2 on this because I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of questions about what about this? How does this affect it? But I have a couple more questions before we wrap up because you are an absolute wealth of knowledge. I think a lot of people should just at least start and are aware, based on everything that you've said so far, they're aware that, hey, I should be tracking my blood glucose in some form or fashion, tracking how I feel, and then ideally picking better sources of food. 2 more questions for you to wrap this up. One is, and I'm very curious because this is a question I actually had with my business partner, recently had a baby. And when you go and they always ask you to do an oral glucose tolerance test. What are your thoughts on that versus maybe trying to have a conversation with your doctor and saying, hey, how about I just wear a CGM and maybe I track my blood glucose over the next 2 or 3 weeks, and you can look at that versus me drinking this huge bolus of disgusting liquid and getting this huge spike. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I definitely think that women should advocate to do that instead and, find a practitioner who will allow them to do that because it's a lot less stressful on the body and you're also learning so much at the same time. So I think it's really such a win-win. And then I do know that there is a company that does make a healthier version of that solution that you have to drink that's like non-GMO and it's made with something organic instead of this like GMO concoction made from like probably corn or something like that. So if your doctor says no, remember you can fire them. You do not, you're not married to them. You can say no to that relationship and find someone else if that feels really aligned with you. I mean, I had to fire many doctors because I think we're so trained to be like, this is my doctor. He's, it's like the red tape. It's like, we have to do what they say. And it's like, you are the one in charge of your health and you can say, no, I don't want to drink that. And I don't want to have a huge, giant, unnatural spike of glucose, which would never occur in nature. Maybe even asking, I don't know if they would allow you to do like a mixed meal test instead, where you could eat like a normal type of meal. But there are a couple of other options. And so I would definitely advocate for those.
Great point. And then last question I have for you is with the holidays, what would you say maybe are your top 3 tips for people? Because they're like, I'm going to be around family. I'm going to have all these temptations. What would be your top 3 tips for helping keep blood glucose in check during the holidays?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to go back to that protein one. So before you go to any holiday party, if you're going to someone's house, load up on protein because it will naturally satiate your appetite. The other one is bring something that you can eat, that you like to eat, that would be good for your blood sugar. So if you there's this dish that I make with roasted Brussels sprouts, pecans, fresh cranberries, and bacon, and I put it in the air fryer and just put some salt and some olive oil on it. It's amazing. So having some sort of side that you can eat, or bring deviled eggs, bring something that is more protein forward or less carb heavy that you can eat. And then consider making some, dessert that doesn't contain loads of sweeteners, or something that I like to set myself up for success with non-bingeable chocolate. So a dark chocolate that you can't really eat too much of. So I love Alter Eco, the mint chocolate that feels very festive and, mint for this season. So having something like that where you know that you just can't eat too much of it because it gets too bitter, and it's like it leaves that nice chocolate taste in your mouth and you're good to go. And the other one is that remembering that stress has a huge impact on our blood sugar. So if you didn't do what you wanted, no one got unhealthy from eating, a lot of food on 1 or 2 days of the year. So it's like, get as soon as you can, get right back on track. Don't wait till the new year, like December 26th. If you celebrate Christmas, like just start to do what you can today. And I got this analogy from one of my past blood sugar mastery clients, and I absolutely love it. And she says that if you fall off the rails, don't just go around and be like, oh, it's all over for me. Like, I might as well just eat everything else. Like, and she compares it to like, if you got a flat tire, you wouldn't just walk around and slash the other 3 tires. So don't keep compounding a mistake, because the quantity that you eat and like the amount of stuff that you eat, that's like not going to be good for your blood sugar, or maybe not something you're used to eating, or highly inflammatory. It's all going to compound. So if it's just like, oh, I had, 1 piece of cake, have the 1 piece of cake and then period, like instead of like, oh, I had the cake, so I might as well have the pizza and the pasta and the whatever, because it's really going to matter. It's really going to be a big difference in your body. And so, and then just move your body. And, if you need to go on a nice walk with your family, like start new holiday traditions, it's like, let's go on a walk after dinner and everyone will feel a little more energized. It's refreshing to take a brisk walk in the cold if you can. So yeah, hope those help.
That's one of my favorites personally. I love taking the walks after the meal. But all of those are incredible tips, Danielle. Thank you so much. This has been like mind-blowing. I think so many people are going to listen to this and be like, I need to start checking my blood glucose like immediately, be more in tune with how I feel, prioritize protein, and all these things. But before we jump off, where can people find you? If people are like, hey, I love what you're saying, I want to learn more about everything that you're talking about, where can they find you?
Yeah, so my website is Danielle Hamilton Health. That's also my Instagram. I make a lot of posts on there. It's also my YouTube. And I have a special gift for your audience, Ryan, that it's my program called Sugar Savvy. It's typically $99, but I'm going to make a coupon code for your people. Do you want the code to be Ryan, or does that work?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
Ryan would be amazing.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
That's
So we'll
awesome.
make this code to get it completely free. And the program is all about what I was talking about earlier about testing your blood sugar. So how to how to ask your doctor for all these tests and what numbers to look at, because I know I just said them all. It's not as easy to like keep them all in your brain. And then how to get these CGMs, and how to put them on, and do they hurt, and can I shower with them? All these questions that I get asked, and also about the finger prick monitors, the ones I recommend, how to like when and how to test and all the things. So it's a complete guide to testing your glucose. And so I'm happy to offer that to all your people.
Oh, thank you so much. We appreciate that. And you've been absolutely incredible. I look forward to talking to you so much more. And everyone, please go check out her social media. I mean, I learn stuff every single day that you post on there. But thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.